In this video, I'm going to explain how we can import a grid from Autocad into STAAD. So we want to import a grid instead of using the default grid like this one here, for example. We need to import the grid from Autocad for a real-world project to make it easier for us to draw the beams for a project like this. For instance, we have a ribbed slab drawn on a grid, and this grid, of course, is something the architect sets up at the start of the project. Then, the structural engineer takes it and builds the slab on it to ensure it aligns with the same lines the architect used, so that all the measurements come out correctly. This grid is made in Autocad as a block to prevent any changes or shifts. Nothing in the building's measurements should change. The reference lines are always fixed. So, if you want to import it to build the beams like this in the column locations, first, you need to explode it so it becomes lines, instead of a single block. When you explode it, you might see things like this due to scale differences in the drawing when they made the grid and its labels. We'll clean them up and move to the grid here. For example, now our grid has become separate lines. To simplify it, you'll find many lines that might not be necessary for you as a structural engineer, because some lines are for the architect. So, you want to simplify it and start with a basic grid. You begin by trimming the grid, like this first grid, for example, passing through the center line of this column, and that column, and so on. But when you reach this column, no, its center is for the next grid. So, this grid here is made for this column. Now, instead, if you align them all on the same line, and then come to this column and do this offset, which is the distance you take from Autocad, there's no need to make a large set of grid lines. This way, you keep the drawing as centered as possible, and you might start by removing this line, for example, to make the import from Autocad as simple as possible. This is necessary, definitely necessary. When you see three clotheslines like this, it's better to take the middle one and maybe remove the others. Continue this method with the rest of the grid lines, horizontally and vertically. For instance, take this horizontal line, remove it, and leave just one. Then, you draw the beams on the lines you've drawn, and anything needing an offset, you simply do it in Autocad. Once done, it's better if you take the grid out of this drawing, bring it here, and not just that. You come here, adjust it, and trim the extra lines so that in Autocad, it looks like this, for example. Then, here, you trim and remove what's unnecessary, so it looks neat. It's better not to leave it in the same file. It's best to copy-paste it all into a new file, and it will look something like this. This is the grid after I took it from Autocad with the distances it was drawn in. We need to note that the distances here are in meters, drawn with dimensions in meters. What I did here is put it in a new file and brought the origin point to its start here on two lines by going to the axis and right-clicking on the origin. I bring the origin here to this corner, so it starts at 0, 0. After that, I save this file as a DXF and name it For example,
بتسميه
grid.
DXF لازم يكون نوعه DXF وبتخزنه بأي مسمى بدك إياه مثلا grid. أوكي سيف.
Then I go to STAAD from the grid here. I have an import DXF file option. I browse for the DXF file I saved. Open it.
بروح بعمل براوز على الملف تبع DXF اللي خزنته. Open.
Here, you'll see the center lines are different. If you have a large file, you select the appropriate layer here. Since I opened a new file, it only has one layer where I drew the grid. If you want to import it from another file without copy-pasting it into a new file, you'll find a large collection of layers here. Go to your specific layer, the one for the grid you want to import. Okay, you'll find the center line here. If you want to delete any lines, you can also delete all the lines here, name them, and specify the units you drew them in, which are in meters. Okay, let me go back to this a bit. Okay, now you have the grid here in units in meters. 0, 3, 17, 4, 5, 8, 6, 7, 10, and so on. Here, 0, 0, 0, because if you want the coordinates x, y, it's written here, but the x gives you also the y. Here's 0, and here's the y, 0x17.3, y019.4x, and so on. An important point here before you start drawing on this grid is to notice that it's on the x and y axis in the plan XY. If you took this grid from Autocad to draw a plan like this, the plan in STAAD must have the y as the gravity direction. Therefore, your plan, like the top view of this node, must be an XZ so that Y comes out of the screen, which is the gravity direction. Therefore, you need to change the orientation of the grid, edit it, and rotate it around the X-axis 90 degrees, like this. It becomes an XZ plan, so when you start drawing the beams like this on the grid, you proceed, whatever the shape.
فهيك انت لما تعمل مثلا تبلش ترسم في البيمز اللي عندك بهذا الشكل على الجريد whatever وتمشي يعني شو ما كان الشكل.
When you apply asylum loads and have gravity load, it should be in negative y. So the gravity load direction is correct. That's everything. And thank you for your attention.
ويعطيكم العافية.